On this evening, our scripture is Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. Acts chapter 15, verses 36 through 41. I selected this passage in hopes that it might help us in the times in which we're living to deal with the obvious differences that people have. As we consider things over just the last year, it is of note that people continually find means to be at odds with one another. Any subtle difference can be enough to divide people, and relationships can be ruined simply by a difference of opinion or perspective that's different than one's own. As I was preparing for this evening's message, there was a debate on the news by the experts. Some experts agree with the CDC that we should be allowed to remove masks, assuming that a person is fully vaccinated. Other experts say it's a rush to judgment. As we listen to people and talk to ministers and leaders of churches all across the country, there is a difference of opinion members have about should we be in service or should we continue online. Teachers and parents are at odds. Should we have students in class or should they continue virtually? We have an issue with Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives. Again, it seems that we continue to find reasons to have the thems and the us's. So I call your attention to Acts chapter 15, hoping to share a biblical point of view that will help us when our perspectives are different. There we read, "And some days after, Paul said unto Barnabas, Let us go again and visit our brethren in every city where we have preached the word of the Lord, and see how they do. And Barnabas determined to take with them John, whose surname was Mark. But Paul thought not good to take him with them, who departed from them from Pamphylia, and went not with them to work. And the contention was so sharp between them that they departed asunder one from the other. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed unto Cyprus. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. And he went through Syria and Cilicia, confirming the churches." What a shame it is when people cannot get along. We can't get along generally because we have differences. And sometimes those differences aren't really that major, but we make it a major thing, and we are determined that the other person or party will see it our way. How do we deal with those times in which two members of the church, two members of a family, just another person with whom you have to deal with, cannot see things eye to eye? It is really impossible for two people to agree on everything all the time. Person who says that they never have a disagreement, someone is not being truthful and just going along to get along. How do we deal with these differences of perspective so that we don't have falling outs like what we see here in Acts chapter 15? Some things that we might need to be aware of the next time those differences surface. First thing that comes to mind is that we have to determine, are we dealing with preferences? Are we dealing with principles? And how much of a priority is the difference? I have come to discover most people are not arguing and not disagreeing over a principle. It's not something that's clearly a matter of right and wrong. It's a matter of preference. Our preferences are our opinions, our way of seeing things. Some things are clearly right or wrong. For example, if we were to have a discussion about the frequency of taking communion, that's a principal issue because the Bible teaches that upon the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. Every week has a first day. So there is no argument about the frequency of taking the Lord's Supper when the principle is clearly stated in the Bible. But again, most of our differences are not over principles, they're over preferences, and we make our personal preferences to rise to the level of a principle. As an example, we could have a discussion as to what time should worship service start. Someone says 9, someone says 10, someone says 11. There is no scriptural example as to what time worship should start. So what time is a matter of preference. But if I take the position that when I was growing up, church started at 11, it's always been 11, and so it should be 11, I am making my preference a matter of principle when in reality it's just a preference. Then we have to determine how much priority should we give to what we disagree on and at the same time ignore what we do have in common. Do you know a lot of times people separate over issues that amount to nonsense and they have so much more in common that they can be working toward? As a matter of dealing with these things, each of us needs to be aware of some things. First of all, we have to be aware of obvious biases. In an obvious bias, that is something that we conscientiously know that we have a bias for or against. So if, for example, a person says, I don't like people of a certain race, that's obvious and you are aware of that. When we have differences with people, we have obvious biases, and that sometimes if we don't like a person for whatever reasons, we tend to discount their perspectives, not because we have considered their perspective, but because we don't like them. At the same time, we go along with a lot of things with people we do like, even though their perspectives may not be as valid as someone else's. We have to also think about what is called implicit bias. And an implicit bias is more subtle, it's automatic, and it's not so intentional. It's something that just happens before you know it. Your bias has come about. In an implicit bias, we have this tendency to naturally do things and believe things without being conscientiously aware of how that is affecting us. For example, when we look at Acts chapter 15, it is possible that there was an implicit bias that Barnabas had, because the Bible teaches us something that is not mentioned here in Acts 15, but is mentioned in Colossians 4 and verse 10. And that is Barnabas and Mark were related. Now, some scholars believe they were cousins. Others say that Mark was his nephew. All agree that they were related. So the fact that Mark and Barnabas had a family relationship can be an example of his bias toward Mark's perspective. And oftentimes we go along with people who are close to us, maybe because of kinship or friendship, and we discount people who perhaps are not as close. So in reality, we're not really addressing issues, we're addressing relationships. But then we have to determine, are we approaching things with humility? Or do we approach things from the standpoint of I'm going to be heard and I don't care what you have to say and how you feel. I'm just going to get my point across. Is that really the godly way of approaching things? When we look at the Bible, the concern is not always about our differences, but it's valuing the relationship. Not the relationship that Barnabas and Mark had, but the God relationship. The fact that we are not only family, we are blood family. Because Romans 5 teaches that we have been both justified by the blood of the Lamb. So if you've been justified by the blood and I've been justified by the blood, not only are we family, but we're blood family. But the problem is that we have a tendency to value other people more than we value other Christians. And we'll say at the end of the day, that's my kin, that's my blood. Is that really how God wants you to look at things? As we consider this difference between Paul and Barnabas, which in reality can be a difference that we see in our own lives, whether it's about mass, in school, in service, political ideologies. Is it that serious? Does it really rise to the level of being that serious? Is it my preference or is it a godly principle? Something to think about next time you have a difference with someone. That's my take on it. This has been another installment of A Few Minutes with the Minister.